Hello and welcome back to White Rose Resistance Radio. I'm sticking to my promise to get content out on a more regular basis. It's been about 12 days since I posted my last video. Um, I am revisiting today the origins of fascism, Benito Mussolini, um, and I hope this is a better quality video than the first time I tried to cover this topic. I'm getting better at editing and trying to make things a little more visually interesting. So we'll grow on this journey together. I'm going to start off by giving a bit of background on Italy. Italy was not a unified country until 1861. The country had been divided since the fall of Rome. Some regions were controlled by local city-states like Florence and Venice, and others were ruled by foreign powers such as Spain and France. And of course, in the central region, there was the Papal States. So it was a mix of republics and monarchies and theocracy until unification um, in 1861. There was a similar thing in Germany. It was a bunch of small principalities that eventually formed together in the mid 19th century into a unified nation state. So we're going to talk about Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was the first fascist. He invented the term fascism. He was born in Dovia di Ridapio, Forli, Romagna. And if I murdered that Italian, please forgive me. Um, He was born in 1883. His father was a blacksmith and a prominent socialist. His mother was a school teacher. Mussolini was named Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini. His parents chose those names to honor prominent socialists. Benito is actually a Spanish name, and it was the name of a prominent socialist, I believe in Mexico at the time. Um, in his early life, Benito was heavily influenced by his father's political views. He graduated from school, was qualified as an elementary school teacher in 1901. In 1902, he left Italy for Switzerland to avoid compulsory military service. He was unable to find consistent work in Switzerland, and he was convicted in absentia for desertion in Italy for refusing compulsory military service. He would later be given amnesty in exchange for agreeing to serve his term in the army in 1904. He did 2 years military service and went back to teaching in 1906. He was still a socialist at this point, and he considered himself to be an intellectual. He wrote a number of socialist tracts, co authored a novel that was very anti clerical. He became one of Italy's leading socialists in the 1910s. So that was where he started. But he became gradually disillusioned with socialism, and he was becoming increasingly anti-egalitarian, which is an important part of his later political philosophy. Egalitarianism is the idea that people are equal, and it is one of the core tenets of socialism. At the start of the First World War, the socialists were opposed to Italy entering the war. It was one of the reasons why Mussolini had fled, because he was anti-war at that time. But his views became increasingly aligned with nationalists in favor of entering the war, and he had his idea that it was good to enter the war because he was hoping that ethnic Italians might gain independence from the Habsburgs in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Um, his views about war and his support of the First World War would get him expelled from the Socialist Party. And he would found his own party. And this is where it all starts to go pear-shaped. He found his own party called Di Fasci di Azione Rivoluzionaria. They called themselves Fascisti, fascist. The Italian word fascismo derives from the Latin, and it essentially means a bundle of sticks. A bound bundle of sticks was an ancient Roman symbol that is also used in the U.S. You'll see it on U.S. currency and so on. It symbolizes strength and unity, out of many one kind of thing. It's a bunch of sticks bound together. There's a picture of it on the slide. Um, he served he served during the First World War, and in 1918 he would call for a leader ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep and revive the nation. So in 1919, he formed the 200-member Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, or the Italian Combat Squad. Um, he would start forming his ideas about foreign policy. He had a concept that he called spazio vitale, vital space, the idea that Italy was overpopulated and it had a right to take land that had once been part of the Roman Empire and take it away from the native, what he considered lesser developed inhabitants, uh, other Europeans. He believed he could end poverty in Italy by taking this vital space. Hitler had a similar expansionist policy where he thought anywhere there were ethnic Germans should be part of Germany. Um, both of these policies were based in social Darwinism, the idea that some people or ethnicities were inherently stronger and therefore superior to other so-called weaker peoples. Um, while Mussolini's fascists were not as racist or at least as anti-Semitic as Hitler's Nazi Party, the whole idea of social Darwinism, I can't even talk today, is inherently racist. It's a racist idea. Racists today still use it as an excuse for their hateful ideas. So he supported the idea that nations with low birth rates were doomed. He which is the thing you hear being echoed by people like Stephen Miller today, and that a high birth rate showed strength. He believed that America was doomed because African Americans, who he saw as inferior, had a higher birth rate than European Americans. So, again, the inherent racism. One of Mussolini's followers, called Dino Grandi, would form militias of veterans, and they were called the Black Shirts. And their purpose was to restore order onto the streets. They would fight with rival political groups like socialists and communists, and the legitimate government did nothing to interfere with any of these conflicts. Um, so Mussolini is prime minister, but the fascists still have a minority in the government. They had to form a coalition government, which you see a lot in European politics still today, with the nationalists and some liberals. And liberal didn't mean what it means now, at least not in the U.S. The way we talk about liberals in the U.S. as being left of center. The liberals were really kind of more center uh, in this period and in Italy. Mussolini's stated goal was to have a totalitarian regime with him in charge. He passed legislation that favored the wealthy and landowning classes. That's part of his whole idea that he doesn't like egalitarianism anymore. He doesn't see all citizens as equal, or all people as equal. Um, he disbanded the labor unions. In 1923, he sent Italian forces into Corfu, which at the time belonged to Greece. The international community, the League of Nations, which was formed after the First World War, really couldn't do anything. The League of Nations really was weak. I mean, the UN's pretty weak, but the League of Nations was even weaker. Um, in 1923, a law called the Acerbo law, I probably massacred that in Italian as well, changed the way Italian elections were held. There was a socialist politician called Giacomo Matteotti And he complained that there were election irregularities in 1924 after this law was passed, and so he was assassinated. The assassin was caught and imprisoned, but when he got out of prison, he admitted that Mussolini had been responsible for this political killing, and they put him back in prison because, of course, you can't have the leader of your country being accused of assassinating his political rivals. Now, can we? So, under Mussolini, from 1925 to 1927, Italy would become a police state. Uh, Mussolini dismantled almost all legal limits on its power. Local autonomy was dismantled. Local elected officials were replaced with state appointed officials. Um, Ethnic Slavs living in Italian controlled territories were persecuted. So, as you can see, with his own sort of brute squad, um, and his political party and his racist ideas, he's positioning himself. And in 1921, he was elected to a seat in the Italian Chamber of Deputies. In October of 1922, around 30,000 black shirts gathered in Rome, demanding that the current prime minister, the elected prime minister, resign. The elected government requested an order of martial law from the king, who, because it was a constitutional monarchy, he still had authority over the military. The king refused to declare martial law, so the legitimate prime minister resigned. It's possible that the king thought he would be able to use these black shirts to his advantage in preventing communists from taking over the country, because everyone was afraid after the Russian Revolution of communism. Um, People were really worried about the workers revolting. Um, so Mussolini was now the prime minister. One of Mussolini's key policy ideas was the Spazio Vitale. Um, we talked about that earlier, the vital space. He believed that the key to economic growth was physically growing the size of the country. So he wanted to take land away from Italy's neighbors, in particular the Balkans. He saw the Slavic peoples as lesser peoples, and he thought Italians were ethnically superior. That goes back to the social Darwinism. And it was the accomplishments of ancient Rome that made him think Italians were so superior to their neighbors. The neighbors were, of course, barbarians who had invaded Rome. Um, to say social Darwinism is not like Darwinism, the actual theory of evolution. Social Darwinism is not scientific. Um, let's see. Here's a quote from Mussolini in 1920. When dealing with such a race as Slavic, inferior and barbarian, we must not pursue the carrot but the stick policy. We should not be afraid of new victims. The Italian border should run across the Brenner Pass, Monte Nevoso, and the Dinaric Alps. I would say we can easily sacrifice 500,000 barbaric Slavs for 50,000 Italians. This was at a speech in Pola, 20th September 1920. Um, In December of 1924, the leaders of the Black Shirts would come to Mussolini and demand that he get rid of all opposition, or they were going to do it themselves. It would, Mussolini basically dropped all pretense of Italy having a democracy, and he began to openly persecute any and all opposition to his rule. Christmas Eve, 1925, he would officially change his title from President of the Council of Ministers to Head of the Government. He was still referred to as Prime Minister by the foreign press. Um, it was shortly after this that Mussolini would have his first assassination attempt. An Irish-born British national named Violet Gibson um, made an attempt on Mussolini's life. She was released without charges, but she did spend the rest of her life in a mental institution in Great Britain. So later in that year, because that was April, by October, a 15-year-old Italian boy named Antio Zamboni um, made an attempt on Mussolini, and he was lynched by the crowd, which is terrifying. Um, there were at least 2 further attempts on Mussolini's life that we know of. There could have been more. There was no independent press. After the attempt on his life by Zamboni, Mussolini would outlaw all non-fascist political parties. So he used this political violence as an excuse to crack down on the opposition. In 1928, parliamentary elections were abolished, uh, and they were replaced with a list of candidates selected by the Grand Council of Fascism. And voters could either approve or reject the list, but the same council would get to suggest lists over and over until one was approved. In order to gain better control over Sicily, Mussolini appointed Cesare Mori as a prefect of the city of Palermo. Mori was told to eliminate the mafia in Sicily. His methods of doing so included torture, holding women and children hostage, laying siege to towns, and this would earn him the title of the Iron Prefect. He would end his reign of terror in 1929, so a year, when Mussolini named him a senator and declared that they had won the war against the mafia. So just declare you've won and move on, I guess. So with his ineffective war on the mafia, Mussolini also had a lot of ineffective economic policies. Some of these included, well, the expansion of the Italian borders was his primary policy, but there were construction programs and some government initiatives. One of the first and most notorious of these initiatives was called the Battle for Wheat. You'll notice that everything is sort of couched in terms of war. The Battle for Wheat established several new model towns and diverted resources away from economically viable crops into wheat production. Farmers would attempt to grow wheat on unsuitable land using so-called modern farming techniques. The wheat harvest did increase slightly, but prices rose and consumer demand plummeted. Tariffs were imposed and subsidies were given to farmers for growing wheat, and this would only increase the national debt. Another failed policy, called the Battle for Land, sensing a pattern here, which aimed to reclaim marshlands and redistribute land to peasant farmers. Fewer than 10,000 people would receive benefits from this program, and they abandoned the policy completely by 1940. Possibly the weirdest policy would be named Gold for the Fatherland, the only one that's not named after a battle or a war. Citizens were encouraged to donate gold jewelry to state officials in charge for a steel wristband that had Gold for the Fatherland etched into it. This donated gold would be melted down, made into gold bars, and distributed to the banks. The government also began taking over private businesses. By 1935, Mussolini claimed that 3/4 of Italian businesses were state-run. In 1935, new edicts would force businesses, banks, and private individuals to surrender all foreign-issued stock and bond holdings to the Bank of Italy. In 1936, price controls were introduced, and barriers to trade with any countries except Germany were implemented. So, one of the ways dictators, authoritarians, fascists get people to go along with their insane policies, which clearly are not based on any kind of logic or reason and don't work, is the cult of personality formed around the leader. And Mussolini had this. In the early days, he was quite popular, as was Hitler in his country. So state propaganda was used to hype up the leader and his achievements as much as possible. State money is spent on showy projects with no real improvements for ordinary people. Mussolini was very good at this. He had teachers swear an oath of support to defend the regime. Newspapers had their editors chosen by Mussolini, and only journalists with a certificate from the party could be employed. They maintained an illusion of the free press because the public did not know about these certificates. Um, most professions were gatekept by organizations that required membership to practice your job, and these organizations were run by the Fascist Party. A youth organization was created to promote fascist ideas to children and indoctrinate them into Mussolini's cult of personality. One of the ways Mussolini won over heavily Catholic Italy was by making peace with the church. Since unification in 1861 and the democratic, well, the, my brain, the uh, constitutional monarchy that predated Mussolini, they had seized the Papal States, and that government and the Pope had been at odds. Mussolini ended up signing an agreement with the Pope, granting Vatican City to the Church and guaranteeing the Pope's rights. Mussolini also swore to uphold the honor and dignity of the Pope, whatever that means. So Mussolini's foreign policies, um, Italy was in no way prepared to enter another war with major European powers. And Mussolini at first was able to avoid a conflict with his former allies of World War One, well, Italy's former allies, um, even though Mussolini himself was not happy with the Treaty of Versailles. But by 1929, he was contemplating a war to take Yugoslavia. Um, he signed a treaty with Germany in 1932, creating an anti French alliance. His plans for Yugoslavia and a war with France were put on hold when he found out that the Italian military codes had been broken by French intelligence. After Hitler rose to power and pro fascist partisans assassinated the Austrian Chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, in 1934, Mussolini warned Hitler not to annex Austria, as he saw some Austrian territory as belonging to Italy. So they had a little dispute there. Um, Mussolini's next move was to invade Ethiopia, and he would declare Italy an empire in May of 1936. Sanctions, of course, were levied against Italy by the League of Nations, and Mussolini considered these an attempt by other powers to keep Italy from expanding. Um, Italian forces in Ethiopia absolutely terrorized the population. And in an effort to rout out opposition, the entire adult male population of one town was executed. Um, Mussolini considered this a first step. His plan was to liquidate terrifying word when you're talking about people, the natives, to make room for Italians. He did not consider Ethiopia to have been a real country because he believed in the inherent inferiority of Africans. Back to the racism. The invasion of Ethiopia cost Italy 12,000 servicemen who lost their lives and put a terrible strain on the Italian economy, which was already struggling after the First World War. And, well, almost everybody was struggling in the 1930s. It also took resources away from the military that members of the military or the senior staff of the military had planned on using to modernize the Italian military. This will become important as we get into the Second World War. Mussolini really had grossly underestimated the cost of annexing Ethiopia, financially and in terms of Italian lives lost. And Ethiopian lives lost is just awful. So the huge backlash against Italy's actions in Ethiopia by the international community drove Mussolini to reverse his stance on Germany taking Austria, and he aligned himself with Hitler, turning his back on Italy's former allies from the First War. In 1939, the so-called Pact of Steel was signed, making Germany and Italy military allies. Italy would provide financial support to nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, which diverted even more funds away from the Italian military's planned modernization. Mussolini's firm belief in Italy's superiority and Italy's destiny to rule the Mediterranean would lead him to be woefully unprepared for the war with England and France. He had hoped to split the former allies by improving his relations with England. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain seemed to be amenable to this until he wasn't. Mussolini was disappointed. Neville Chamberlain visited Rome and declared that while England wanted good relations with Italy, they would not alienate France. In April of 1939, Italy would begin its invasion of Albania. When Hitler announced his intention to invade Poland, he suggested Italy should take Yugoslavia. So they're just divvying up Europe amongst themselves. Mussolini, or at least his generals, knew they were not ready for the global conflict that would kick off. And so they were talked off the ledge from invading Yugoslavia. But Germany's invasion of Poland was the real kickoff to the Second World War. And because Italy was now aligned with Germany, they were now at war with their former allies of England and France. So Mussolini was completely convinced of an early German victory, and he decided to stick in with his alliance with Germany. He was going to stick it out. He thought it would be over soon. He ignored overtures from England and France, who wanted Italy to rejoin the Allies from the First War. The stage was all set, and the players had all chosen sides. Well, except for the Americans. The Americans were reluctant to join in another world war, and while they had a lot of sympathy for England, they chose to provide support in the form of supplies and not troops yet. Some of this was anti-war sentiment after the First World War, but also there was a very strong fascist movement in the United States and even in the UK that supported Hitler's Germany. There was a very large rally of fascists that was held at Madison Square Garden on the 20th of February, 1939, just on the eve of the war. So I'm not going to go into a complete blow by blow of the Second World War. It's covered really well. There's a lot of documentaries and books. I'm really doing this to show how fascism affected the economy, the ordinary people, and how did this happen? How did we get here? Did people oppose the fascists? Yes. There were many people who opposed the fascists right from the beginning. People who opposed Mussolini. Um, there were several assassination attempts, as we covered earlier. Um, there were also a lot of people who supported the fascists. I mean, fascism always has an appeal to a certain set of people. It offers simple solutions to complex problems that don't really work. It allows you to not have to think about things too hard because the strong leader is going to take care of you. And if things start going wrong, it's not the leader's fault. It's um, the other, the outsiders. The Germans blame the Jews and the Roma and the Slavs. The Italians blame their former allies from the First World War. Inferior peoples causing Italy's problems. It's an us and them situation. And I have a quote out of from Terry Pratchett, the fantasy author, that has a lot of really wise stuff in his books. It was so much easier to blame it on them. It was bleakly depressing to think that they were us. If it was them, then nothing was anyone's fault. If it was us, what did that make me? After all, I'm one of us. I must be. I've certainly never thought of myself as one of them. No one ever thinks of themselves as one of them. We're always one of us. It's them that do the bad things. Terry Pratchett from Jingo. Um, in my mind, fascism is basically lazy thinking. Democracy is hard work. You need an educated and interested electorate for it to function. You need sincere and motivated people to run for office. You need to be vigilant and guard your rights. Fascism and other types of authoritarian regimes allow ordinary people to just check out and ignore everything until they become that other that the regime is targeting. Because no one is really safe, especially when things start to go wrong. So, fascism was a worldwide phenomenon in the 1930s, but it started with the Italians. Germany and the Spanish, and you could even argue the Japanese regime would fall into the fascist category. Um, all fascists are authoritarians, but not all authoritarians are fascists, although really there's very little difference. Um, there were even people in the countries fighting the fascists who were pro fascist. And a lot of the racist ideas that the fascists promoted were believed by more people than were willing to go as far as they did. Um, in order to keep our republic and democratic systems in place, you have to be vigilant against fascist ideology and thin end of the wedge type fascist policies where they try and sneak a little in here and there and try and open it up to full on dictatorship. The main thing to keep from, I guess, enabling fascism is to not let them use their propaganda to mislead you into blaming marginalized groups for your problems. It's all downhill from there. If you're blaming your neighbor, if you're blaming immigrants, if you're blaming people from other religions for things that you think are wrong with the country, you are taking another step towards fascism. Um, Racism and fascism go hand in hand, um, and also ideas that some people are somehow inherently inferior to others. Um, you have to remember that fascism only benefits those at the very, very top. Um, and everyone else kind of gets screwed. Um, to quote the great Studio Ghibli film Porco Rosso, it's better to be a pig than a fascist. So I'm going to leave it here. Um, if you want to know more, I'm going to have references in the description. Mussolini came to a very sticky end in the end. Um, After southern Italy uh, surrendered to the Allies, he fled to northern Italy, which was still controlled by the Germans. They were trying to smuggle him out of the country when some Italian partisans found them, and he was fleeing with his mistress, not his wife, and they shot him and his mistress, and they hung them up in a public square in Milan, where their corpses were abused. Um, Really a horrific end. Um, and we all know what happened to Hitler. He committed suicide in a bunker with his longtime mistress, Eva Braun. So fascism usually doesn't end well for even those that benefited for it. It it doesn't work. Um, even if you, even if you can't, even if you don't accept the moral arguments against fascism, it flat out does not work. It does not make life better for anybody except the people at the very top of the system, and that's what it's designed to do. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts. I hope everyone is having a good week. If you feel like you learned anything or you enjoyed the content at all, give me a like and subscribe. I am working really hard to get some more of these out. I'm researching a future episode on the Luddites that I think I mentioned last time, but that's going to take a while to put together. So I'll probably be remaking some of my old videos like this one. Um, I really appreciate you all listening, if any, and watching, and have a beautiful rest of your week.